Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. We will now begin with story 1, the barber surgeon's blade, medicine on the battlefield. Imagine the clamor of steel against steel, the cries of men falling to the ground, and the dense smell of blood, sweat, and mud thick in the air. The medieval battlefield was not just a place of combat. It was a space where medicine met improvisation, and survival depended not just on bravery, but also on the steady hands of the barber surgeons. These men, often dismissed by scholars as mere tradesmen, stood as the first line of healing in a world where doctors rarely ventured near the front lines. You might picture a battlefield medic with advanced tools and antiseptics, but in the 12th or 13th centuries, the tools were simpler bone saws, razors, and cautery irons. Cleanliness was a luxury. Anesthetics, mostly imagination or prayer. The barber surgeon worked fast, not because he was efficient, but because the patient would die of shock or bleeding if he didn't. But how did these men, many of them trained first to shave beards and pull teeth, become the battlefield lifelines of medieval armies? From the barbershop to the battlefield. The term barber surgeon was not always associated with gore. In fact, barbers were originally part of a broader class of artisans handy with blades, yes, but not necessarily involved in medicine. However, as the Christian Church increasingly prohibited monks from spilling blood, after all, bloodletting was seen as a sin by many ecclesiastical orders. Someone else had to take up the task. That someone, the neighborhood barber. By the 12th century, these barbers became known for performing minor surgeries, amputations, bloodletting, and wound dressing. On the battlefield, they became indispensable. Unlike physicians, who were classically educated in Latin and Galen's theories, barber surgeons relied on practical experience. They learned by doing on living, bleeding, groaning bodies. Barber surgeons were often recruited into armies, especially during the Crusades. These campaigns exposed them to injuries beyond anything they had seen in their towns: arrow extractions, sword gashes, festering wounds, crushed bones, and burns from boiling oil. Their tools were packed into simple leather rolls, their knowledge passed orally or through worn, handwritten manuals. Few could read. Even fewer had access to the rare surgical texts written in Latin. Still, when the fighting was over and the moans of the dying filled the air, it was the barber surgeon who came with cloth, alcohol, if there was any, and steel. Tools of the trade, a look inside the surgeon's kit. The medieval barber surgeon's kit was brutal in its simplicity. Bone saw used for amputations. It was fast and the blade was rarely clean. Cautery iron, a heated metal rod used to seal wounds by burning them shut. Painful, but effective at least sometimes. Fleam and lancet, tools used for bloodletting, a common practice believed to restore balance among the body's four humors. Forceps and hooks, to remove arrowheads and other embedded debris. Needles and thread, sometimes silk, sometimes linen, sometimes soaked in wine to cleanse. Sponges and towels, reused and rarely cleaned properly. Anesthetics were primitive. Sometimes wine or vinegar was used to numb the area, or a patient was given opium poppy if it was available, a luxury in most places. More often, the solution was to have the patient bite down on leather or wood and hope he passed out quickly. The effectiveness of these tools was inconsistent. Infection was common, often fatal. Still, some men survived miraculously so, and the barber surgeon became both a feared and respected figure among soldiers. Bleeding to balance, the four humors and battlefield medicine. Behind many medical procedures in the Middle Ages was the ancient theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was believed to be a matter of balance among these. Too much blood, let it out. Too much black bile, time for purgatives. This system, inherited from ancient Greek medicine and championed by Galen, remained the foundation of Western medical thought for centuries. Barber surgeons were expected to balance the humors. This often meant bloodletting regardless of the injury. Soldiers suffering from wounds would be bled to prevent fevers. If they were feverish, they might be bled more. Though it sounds counterintuitive now, such measures were thought to draw out corruptions or poisons from the blood. It was not unusual for soldiers to survive gruesome amputations only to die of fever days, later likely from infections introduced during surgery. Yet in the logic of the day, such deaths were rarely blamed on poor hygiene. Instead, they were attributed to an imbalance in the humors or divine will. Experimentation in the field. While university-trained physicians were debating Aristotle and Galen in lecture halls, barber surgeons were performing experimental procedures out of necessity. They learned through experience, often at great cost. Trial and error was the rule, not the exception. Some of the earliest surgical manuals, like Chirurgia Magna by Guy de Chauliac, 14th century, drew heavily from the practical knowledge of surgeons. De Chauliac, though a university-trained physician, respected the empirical work done by surgeons in the field. His text became a standard for centuries. Among the procedures performed by barber surgeons were trepanation, drilling into the skull to relieve pressure, used for head injuries, though success rates were low. Amputation, a last resort but increasingly common during siege warfare. Cauterization, not just for closing wounds, but also used to prevent poison from spreading. They were also among the first to use antiseptic agents such as wine or vinegar to cleanse wounds. Though they lacked a germ theory of disease, they began to notice that certain practices led to better outcomes. This quiet observation helped shape early surgical practice long before formal medical theory caught up. The surgeon's place in society. Despite their vital role, barber surgeons occupied an awkward social status. They were not respected like physicians, who dressed in robes, spoke Latin, and avoided touching patients whenever possible. Surgeons used their hands. They worked in blood. Their training was apprenticeship-based, not academic. They were craftsmen more akin to blacksmiths than scholars. Still, kings and nobles needed them. A skilled barber surgeon might find employment in a noble court or military garrison. Others traveled with mercenary companies or offered their services as itinerant healers, treating villagers and soldiers alike. Their value was practical, not theoretical, and while they were sometimes mocked or looked down upon by the learned elite, they were the ones who actually saved lives or at least delayed death. Death, disease, and the limits of healing. Most barber surgeons knew they could only do so much. Without antibiotics, many wounds turned septic. Without knowledge of germ theory, hygiene remained rudimentary. The battlefield was a breeding ground for infections, and even the best surgical work often led to gangrene or death. Yet the efforts of these early practitioners were not in vain. They kept men alive who might otherwise have bled out. They removed arrows, sawed through shattered limbs, and comforted the dying. In their crude methods were the roots of modern trauma surgery. Their lives were hard, their tools crude, but their work mattered. And over time, as surgical manuals spread and military medicine advanced, their legacy grew. Unresolved thought to end Section 1. What did it mean to heal in a world where pain was constant and death never far behind? As barber surgeons honed their blades and treated torn flesh under smoky torches, were they merely prolonging suffering, or were they laying the groundwork for something more enduring? Between wars, where surgeons learned to sew flesh. War was not constant. Between campaigns, armies disbanded or garrisoned in castles and towns. During these intervals, barber surgeons often returned to civilian life or brought their battlefield experience into new realms. Whether it was treating a noble wound from a hunting accident, setting the broken leg of a fallen servant, or pulling teeth in a noisy village square, these men were always at work. What set the barber surgeon apart wasn't just what he did, but how he learned. In a world without formal surgical schools for most of the Middle Ages, knowledge passed through apprenticeship. A young man might start by sharpening blades, boiling water, and cleaning linens. Then he'd assist with minor procedures, learning when to hold a limb still, when to apply pressure, when to look away. Only after years of observing and helping would he be trusted to stitch or cut. There were no exams, no diplomas, only hands-on practice, and for the best among them, growing reputations. In the 13th century, cities like Paris and Bologna began to formalize surgery. But these centers remained rare. Most learning stayed oral, practical, and painfully slow. The rise of guilds and regulated surgery. By the late 1200s and into the 14th century, barber surgeons in places like France and England began organizing into guilds, professional groups that regulated who could practice, how apprentices were trained, and what tools could be used. The Guild of Surgeons of Paris became particularly influential. Guilds served several purposes. Standards, while not always enforced, the guilds outlined practices for safe and effective treatment. Education, apprenticeships became more structured. Examinations, oral and practical, were introduced. Division of labor, the distinction between barber and surgeon, began to sharpen. Barbers handled grooming, bloodletting, and minor wounds. Surgeons took on more complex procedures like amputations and tumor removals. Still, in most rural areas, the difference remained blurred. The man who shaved your beard might also be the one who reset your dislocated shoulder. Guilds also gave surgeons status. As members, they could demand fair payment, protect their trade from impostors, and most importantly challenge the dominance of university-trained physicians. Yet they were still barred from the most elite circles of medicine. Latin-speaking doctors viewed surgeons as laborers, not thinkers. The barber surgeon's stained apron and practical knowledge stood in contrast to the physician's ink-stained hands and philosophical discourse. Tools refined, from iron hooks to surgical precision. With growing experience and exposure to varied injuries, surgeons began refining their tools. Needles became finer, enabling neater sutures and better healing. Some were curved for internal stitching, a revolutionary step. Catgut sheep intestine began replacing linen thread. It was absorbable and didn't require removal, reducing the risk of infection. Scalpels were sharpened thinner, making incisions cleaner, less traumatic to surrounding tissue. Cautery irons were redesigned to be more maneuverable, with curved or angled tips for precise burning. One overlooked but important innovation was the use of ligatures tying off blood vessels to stop bleeding rather than cauterizing. This idea had been known since ancient times but was rarely practiced. In the 14th century, surgeons like Guy de Chauliac began advocating it more widely, especially after seeing it reduce post-operative deaths. Still, many stuck with cautery, believing heat drove out poisons more effectively. Ligatures required fine motor control and a level of sterility that was hard to maintain in muddy tents or smoky castles. Medieval wound care, poultices, salves, and animal parts. Stitching was only half the battle. The true challenge came in preventing infection. Barber surgeons turned to herbal poultices, often learned from folk healers and midwives. Common treatments included honey, known today to have antibacterial properties. It was used to pack wounds and keep them moist. Wine and vinegar, poured into wounds to cleanse them. Harsh, painful, but sometimes effective. Myrrh and frankincense, used as antiseptics or to reduce swelling. Animal fats, combined with herbs to create salves. These helped keep wounds soft and protected from air and flies. Moss and cobwebs, used as bandaging. Absorbent, sometimes effective though not sterile. One popular treatment for arrow wounds was to fill the puncture with a garlic-based paste and then heat it with a metal rod, cauterizing the inside. It was crude, but in some cases it worked. Another common battlefield problem was bone fractures. Without X-rays or advanced knowledge of anatomy, setting a bone was mostly guesswork. Splints made from wood, linen, or even metal strips were used to hold limbs still. If the bone broke through the skin, the risk of infection skyrocketed. And then there were burns from boiling oil, fire arrows, or torches. These were often treated with egg whites, vinegar, and lead-based creams. Ironically, the lead may have helped seal the skin, but it also slowly poisoned many survivors. Patience and pain, a surgeon's reputation. Barber surgeons walked a fine line. Too aggressive and they killed. Too timid and they were useless. The best among them developed a feel for the body not just mechanically, but intuitively. They learned when to cut, when to wait, and how to read the body's signs. Their reputation often spread by word of mouth. A surgeon who saved a nobleman from gangrene might be rewarded with coin, land, or employment. One who botched an amputation might be chased from town. Records from England and France show barber surgeons serving in royal households, attending tournaments, and even accompanying nobles on long journeys in case of illness or injury. While they were still beneath physicians in status, the distance was narrowing. Some even gained fame. John of Ardern, a 14th-century English surgeon, wrote surgical texts based on his experiences treating battlefield injuries and anal fistulas. His work included detailed illustrations, advice on patient care, and instructions for pain management. He openly criticized physicians who avoided patients and defended the surgeon's role as both healer and craftsman. Ardern also warned against overconfidence, reminding young surgeons that more are killed by haste than hesitation. The influence of the church and religion. While the church restricted monks from performing surgery, it remained deeply involved in healthcare. Many barber surgeons operated near or within monastic hospitals, treating the poor and wounded under religious oversight. Relics and prayer were often part of healing. Before surgery, a patient might be blessed. Afterward, monks might apply holy oil or relics of saints to speed recovery. Some believed that wounds were divine punishment, and healing could only occur if the patient repented. This theological view sometimes interfered with care, particularly when a wound was seen as a just affliction. Yet others saw surgery itself as a godly act, a way to extend life, relieve pain, or enable penance. Barber surgeons, though not clergy, navigated these spaces with caution. They often worked under the protection of bishops or abbots, who recognized the need for practical healing even as they emphasized the power of prayer. Pain and pain relief. No discussion of surgery in the Middle Ages is complete without addressing pain. Pain was constant. It was expected, even theologically meaningful. Many believed it was a way to share in Christ's suffering or to purify the soul. Still, barber surgeons were not without compassion. They used opium, poppy, and henbane, mixed into drafts to dull the senses. Mandrake root, used to induce a sleepy, sedated state. Ale and wine, heavily consumed before surgery. Blows to the head, sometimes intentional, to knock a patient unconscious. Anesthetics were dangerous. Overdosing on opium or henbane could kill. Underdosing meant the patient screamed and possibly died from shock. Finding the right amount was an art. The surgeon had to balance speed with precision. Amputations were often done in under 2 minutes. Sutures were fast. Pain was minimized by practice, not by medication. One 14th-century account tells of a knight who sang psalms during his amputation to distract himself. Another gripped a sword in his mouth to stop from biting through his tongue. The barber surgeon stood by, silent but focused, working not just against time but against death itself. Between life and death, the daily calculus of a surgeon. Each time a barber surgeon picked up his tools, he entered into a gamble, a silent contest between knowledge, chance, and the unknown. He could not see bacteria. He had no antibiotics. His instruments were often reused, only cleaned by wiping them on cloth or dipping them in wine. And yet, day after day, he was asked to perform miracles on the broken bodies brought to him. This role was not just medical, it was existential. To be a surgeon was to carry the weight of someone else's fate with each incision. Mistakes were visible, failures were immediate, and success, often short-lived. Many patients lived only a few days after surgery. Others survived, only to carry lifelong disability. There were no prosthetics beyond wooden legs or leather slings. Yet somehow, these patients and their surgeons adapted, and their persistence carried medical practice forward. Barber surgeons did not see themselves as heroes or pioneers. They were simply necessary. As long as men fought, fell, and bled, someone had to pick up the pieces. Crossroads of tradition and innovation. While barber surgeons were often bound by ancient ideas, particularly the four humors and Galenic medicine, they were also among the first to question those systems in practice. Through experience, not theory, they found methods that worked better, even if they couldn't explain why. For example, washing wounds with wine became common not because of scientific insight, but because it simply seemed to help. Suturing internal injuries emerged after battlefield experience showed external stitching alone wasn't enough. Empirical knowledge of anatomy advanced not in the university lecture halls, but through repeated, real-world dissections of the wounded and dead. In Italy, by the 14th and 15th centuries, public dissections of criminals were sometimes allowed, providing invaluable insight for trained surgeons. In Bologna and Padua, universities began embracing surgery as a scholarly pursuit, especially under the influence of Arab medical texts that preserved and extended classical Greek knowledge. Figures like Abulcasis, Avicenna, and later Andreas Vesalius began to change the narrative. Surgeons were no longer just mechanics of the body, they were becoming scientists of flesh. Still, the divide remained. Even in the 15th century, the physician wrote the prescription, the surgeon carried it out. Authority was retained by the Latin-educated elite. Practical knowledge lagged behind academic prestige. Surgery at scale, wars that changed the trade. As medieval Europe moved toward the Renaissance, the nature of warfare changed, and with it, the demands on surgery. The 100 Years' War 1337–1453 between England and France produced unprecedented numbers of wounded. With the introduction of longbows, crossbows, and eventually gunpowder weapons, injuries became more complex. Arrows shattered bones, cannonballs mangled limbs. New weapons demanded new surgical solutions. Surgeons developed better techniques for amputation, including stepwise removal of tissue to preserve more flesh and reduce bleeding, use of tourniquets to slow blood flow before cutting, a practice previously avoided but increasingly embraced, improved cauterization tools with curved irons designed for difficult-to-reach areas. In some cases, battlefield surgeons even began keeping records notebooks describing what had worked, what had failed, and how particular wounds presented. These were not yet scientific papers, but they laid a quiet foundation for evidence-based medicine. The wars of the late Middle Ages, grim as they were, unintentionally became the world's largest training ground for trauma surgery. The road to recognition. In 1540, though slightly beyond the traditional medieval period, the Company of Barber Surgeons was formally established in England by royal charter from King Henry VIII. This official merger of barbers and surgeons marked a turning point. Surgery was becoming professionalized. Guilds gained legal protections. Apprenticeships were standardized. This shift didn't erase the bloody, hands-on roots of the trade, but it began elevating the surgeon's status. By the 17th century, barber surgeons would begin to diverge from barbers entirely, eventually forming the Royal College of Surgeons in 1800. But that legacy started in muddy tents, smoky monasteries, and the shadow of castle walls where the medieval barber surgeon stood alone, stitching, sawing, and praying. Tools of transformation, from blade to scalpel. The transition from crude battlefield surgery to refined practice was not immediate, but the seeds were planted by those early, uncelebrated practitioners. Some key changes included standardization of surgical instruments, influenced by translations of Arabic medical texts, greater anatomical understanding, especially in Italian universities where dissection was allowed, reintroduction of classical knowledge via the Renaissance rediscovery of Greek and Roman texts, better record keeping, allowing knowledge to be shared more widely across regions. The surgeon's blade became not just a symbol of survival, but of progress. One of the most symbolic changes was the gradual replacement of the bloodletting knife, long a staple of the barber's kit, with the scalpel, a tool of precision and learning. What had once been a trade defined by necessity was becoming a profession guided by inquiry. Reflections on human survival. So, what does the legacy of the barber surgeon teach us? That human resilience often grows in the most difficult conditions. That knowledge can emerge not just from books, but from lived experience. That the line between superstition and science is often walked by those willing to act before they fully understand. Barber surgeons were not saints, scientists, or saviors, but they were men who faced suffering directly, with little more than iron, cloth, and courage. They worked while others recoiled. They tried when the odds were long, and even when they failed, their work helped shape the next attempt. They represent the slow, painful evolution of healing, one born not in the ivory towers of universities, but in the bloodied hands of tradesmen who dared to cut, to stitch, and to learn. Final reflection: the blood that bound history. The next time you pass a barber pole, its red and white stripes spiraling upward, you're looking at history. The red stands for blood, the white for bandages. That humble symbol is a relic of the barber surgeon's trade, a quiet testament to a time when one man held the razor, the needle, and the burden of survival. As history moved forward, the surgeon would gain respect, tools, and knowledge. But in those early days, he worked alone with only instinct, experience, and the quiet hope that the next cut might save a life. What if the origins of modern surgery had less to do with science and more to do with necessity, desperation, and the will to keep someone breathing? Story 2: Wormhood and Wounds, Monastic Infirmaries and Herb Gardens. Introduction: a different kind of hospital. It is the early 12th century. The air is damp with mist, and a distant bell tolls across a quiet valley. Inside a high stone wall, beyond the scriptorium and the refectory, lies a low building with narrow windows, the smell of lavender and boiling broth drifting from its open door. This is no castle, it is no marketplace, and it is certainly no battlefield. This is a monastic infirmary, part of a medieval monastery, a world apart from the noise and violence outside. Here, monks in simple habits move slowly and deliberately. One crushes herbs with a pestle and mortar. Another gently checks a sleeping patient's brow. Others read from tattered texts illuminated with red ink and Latin script. They are not physicians. They are not barber surgeons. But they are healers in the way their world understands healing. If the barber surgeon worked with the immediacy of trauma and pain, the monastic infirmary operated with quiet, routine care, a place where the suffering were tended not just with bandages, but with prayer, contemplation, and an astonishing array of herbal remedies. But how did these religious communities come to be centers of healing in medieval Europe? The monastery as a center of care. From the early Middle Ages onward, monasteries served as the heart of healing for many communities. In a world with few hospitals and fewer trained doctors, monasteries offered something rare: stability, cleanliness, literacy, and an ethos of service. Following the rule of St. Benedict written in the 6th century, monks were called to care for the sick as they would care for Christ himself. As a result, most monasteries established infirmaries, dedicated spaces to treat illness, injury, and the elderly. These infirmaries weren't bustling hospitals in the modern sense. They were quiet, orderly rooms attached to the cloister, often with individual beds, wooden partitions, and access to an herbal garden. The focus was on rest, spiritual healing, and gentle medical care grounded in both observation and religious doctrine. Monasteries also maintained guest houses for pilgrims, the poor, and the sick from surrounding villages. In an age without social safety nets, the monastery served as a rare refuge for the ill and destitute. The cloister garden, source of medicine. Just steps from the infirmary was its beating heart, the herb garden. Unlike modern medical institutions, which rely on labs and pharmaceuticals, medieval monasteries relied on what they could grow. These physic gardens were carefully cultivated, often surrounded by low stone walls or wooden fences to keep out animals and preserve the plants. Here are some of the most commonly grown and used herbs. Wormwood Artemisia absinthium, used to treat intestinal worms and digestive complaints. Yarrow Achillea millefolium, known for staunching bleeding and helping wounds clot. Comfrey Symphytum officinale, referred to as knitbone, it was applied to broken limbs and bruises. Valerian, Valeriana officinalis, administered to calm anxiety and aid sleep. Lavender, for headaches and as a disinfectant. Rue, sage, mint, fennel, horehound, and mallow were also commonly used. Each herb had specific planting seasons, harvesting methods, and drying rituals. Monks would often note when a plant should be harvested, perhaps at dawn, after a particular feast day, or before the full moon. These traditions mixed botanical knowledge with spiritual symbolism, shaping a careful rhythm of planting and gathering. Drying racks, hanging bundles, and glass vials filled with oils were stored in the apothecary, usually a side room near the kitchen or the library. Healing by the book, medical manuscripts, and monastic knowledge. Though monks lived largely removed from the outside world, they were among the most literate members of medieval society. Scribes copied not only theological works but also medical texts, often in Latin, drawing from Roman and Greek sources preserved by early Christians and Islamic scholars. Key works included De Materia Medica by Dioscorides, a cornerstone of herbal medicine, copied in many monasteries. Isidore of Seville's Etymology, a 7th century encyclopedia of all knowledge, including medicine. The works of Galen and Hippocrates, often interpreted through Christian lenses. Monks annotated, translated, and recopied these texts, sometimes adding local remedies and observations in the margins. Over time, these texts formed a sort of practical medical library, passed down through generations of monastic communities. Interestingly, many manuscripts also contained astrological charts, reflecting the belief that the stars influenced health. Treatment schedules might be based on lunar phases or planetary positions. While this may seem unscientific now, it reflected a holistic worldview, one that saw the heavens, the body, and the spirit as interconnected. Treatments in the infirmary. The infirmary monk, often called the infirmarian, was tasked with caring for both brothers and outside patients. His methods were gentle, methodical, and deeply influenced by both scripture and observation. Common treatments included poultices, crushed herbs wrapped in cloth and applied to wounds or swollen joints. Infusions and decoctions, boiled herbs used as tonics or teas. Bathing, surprisingly common in some monasteries, especially for the sick. Dietary regimens, food was medicine. Broth, bread, and warm gruel were staples. Certain fasts were waived for the ill. Bleeding and purging, influenced by humorism, though less aggressive than in secular settings. Prayer and relics, healing masses, chants, and the laying on of sacred objects played a central role. Monks believed that physical and spiritual health were deeply connected. A wound of the flesh might mirror a wound of the soul. As such, confession, communion, and prayer were often prescribed alongside herbal remedies. The day in the life of an infirmarian. A monk assigned to the infirmary lived on a different schedule than his brothers. He rose before dawn to prepare herbal infusions and tend to wounds. He was excused from certain prayer so he could bathe or feed patients. He kept records often crude of what worked and what didn't. He cared not only for the ill, but also the aged and dying monks, offering both comfort and companionship. Infirmarians worked in silence, focusing not on ambition but service. They were among the most trusted monks in the abbey, often chosen for their calm temperament and steady hands. Some went on to become traveling healers, sent to nearby villages during outbreaks or to assist noble families. Their knowledge was respected, sometimes even envied by secular physicians and surgeons. Unresolved thought to end Section 1. The monastic infirmary offered a haven of care in a world of chaos. But as towns grew and secular medicine advanced, could these quiet cloisters continue to serve the sick as effectively as before? Or would the world outside begin to surpass them in healing knowledge and skill? Between science and salvation, the dual nature of monastic healing. In the medieval monastery, healing wasn't just about the body, it was about the soul. For the infirmarian, tending a wound was a sacred act. Illness, after all, was often interpreted as a divine message, a test of faith, or even a form of spiritual purification. Healing the sick meant navigating not just the symptoms of the flesh, but the mysteries of suffering. At the heart of this system was the belief that God was the ultimate physician. The monks acted as instruments of his will. They did not believe they healed anyone on their own, but that they simply applied remedies as part of a greater spiritual plan. Even the most humble herb gathered at dawn and boiled in a clay pot was thought to work only if it pleased God. Yet despite these theological underpinnings, monastic medicine was remarkably methodical. The sick were assessed, patterns of illness were observed, calendars were maintained to chart relapses and recoveries. They recorded how wounds looked, what herbs had been given, and whether or not the patient improved. This unique balance between faith and empiricism allowed monasteries to become repositories of both spiritual care and medical progress. The monk as botanist, early botanical knowledge. Over time, monks developed a refined understanding of plants, not just for healing, but for how they thrived: soil quality, moisture, sun exposure. Some monasteries had sophisticated irrigation systems, especially in southern Europe. Others grew non-native herbs in greenhouses or imported seeds from far-off lands via trade or pilgrimage routes. Their knowledge wasn't limited to observation. Monks often categorized plants by temperature: hot, cold, moist, dry, in line with the four humors. Use: external wounds, internal digestion, emotional melancholy, spiritual incense or purification. Toxicity: some were noted as harmful unless prepared precisely, such as foxglove or henbane. They developed compendia of plants, many based on earlier Greek or Arab texts, but adapted to local climate and usage. These were often copied in illuminated manuscripts, some of which survive today. They show careful illustrations of leaves, flowers, roots, and notes on dosage and preparation. One of the most famous examples is the Herbarium of Apuleius Platonicus, a Latin text copied in monasteries across Europe, blending classical botany with Christian symbolism. Plants were sometimes linked to saints or biblical stories, further entwining healing with theology. The influence of Hildegard of Bingen. No discussion of monastic medicine can ignore Hildegard of Bingen, 1098–1179, a Benedictine abbess, mystic, composer, and healer. Though a woman in a male-dominated religious structure, Hildegard's writings became foundational texts in medieval herbalism and holistic medicine. Her major medical works include Physica, detailing the healing properties of plants, animals, and stones; Causae et Curae, exploring causes of disease, remedies, and a deep spiritual analysis of health. Hildegard emphasized balance not only of humors, but of the human relationship with nature and God. She believed that disease often stemmed from a disruption in this harmony, whether through sin, poor diet, or emotional distress. Her remedies were grounded in experience and observation. She described how fennel soothed digestion, how lavender calmed the nerves, and how rosemary promoted clarity of thought. She also included treatments for melancholy, fevers, and even what we might now call anxiety. Though later dismissed during more scientific eras, Hildegard's writings are today recognized for their contributions to early holistic medicine and for being some of the most detailed herbal records of the Middle Ages. Caring for the community. While monastic infirmaries were primarily built for the monks themselves, many abbeys extended their care to the outside world, especially in times of plague or famine. Poor villager, without means to see a physician, might receive topical ointments for boils or rashes, teas for fevers or nausea, food and lodging for the very ill, spiritual care, including last rites. Some monasteries developed guest infirmaries, distinct from the monks' quarters. Here, laypeople could be treated without compromising the cloistered life of the order. These infirmaries were often more rustic but still followed similar protocols: clean bedding, herbal treatments, and prayer. In many ways, monasteries functioned as proto-hospitals, centers of care, learning, and limited public health. In rural areas, they were often the only medical resource for miles. However, this outreach was not always equal. Some orders prioritized care for the poor and sick, while others, especially wealthier houses, focused inward. Monasteries near cities were more likely to develop robust medical ministries than isolated abbeys in the highlands or forests. Cleanliness, structure, and ritual. Monasteries were among the cleanest places in medieval Europe. While cities teemed with filth, and most homes lacked even a basic latrine, monasteries had stone-built latrines, often with running water; bathing schedules, especially for the sick; clean linens, laundered with soap made from ashes and animal fat; separate kitchens for the infirm, offering tailored diets. Cleanliness was not only about health, it was about ritual purity. Washing the body before prayer, anointing the sick with oil, and purifying spaces with incense were all spiritual acts. Yet they also had practical effects, reducing infection and promoting healing. This attention to routine, quiet, and cleanliness made monastic infirmaries more conducive to recovery than many secular alternatives. Patients rested in silence, received nourishment, and were surrounded by order, a contrast to the noisy, chaotic streets of medieval towns. Medicine and astrology. Though monasteries emphasized prayer, they were not immune to the wider beliefs of their age, including astrology. Many infirmaries had manuscripts or charts detailing the positions of stars and planets. Treatments were sometimes delayed or administered based on lunar cycles or planetary alignments. For example, bloodletting was often scheduled according to zodiac signs. Certain herbs were believed to be more potent if harvested under specific planetary influences. The moon's phase might determine the right time to administer purgatives or perform a minor surgery. While this may seem unscientific, it reflected a worldview where macrocosm and microcosm were linked, the universe influencing the body. Monks saw no contradiction between this and their theology. After all, if God made the heavens, might he not use them to guide healing? When secular medicine arrived. By the 13th century, medical universities began to rise, particularly in Salerno, Montpellier, Bologna, and Paris. These institutions trained physicians in anatomy, theory, and classical texts. Most wrote in Latin. Few practiced surgery. Almost none visited monastic infirmaries. Still, the growing influence of secular medicine slowly began to eclipse monastic healing. As towns grew and cities expanded, hospitals funded by guilds, cities, or wealthy patrons emerged. These institutions were often more focused on acute care, treating injuries, managing fevers, and even performing simple surgeries. Monasteries, in contrast, remained quiet places of long-term care, more hospice than hospital. Some monks welcomed this shift, seeing it as an opportunity to focus more on spiritual healing. Others resisted, continuing to practice herbal medicine even as doctors in cities began discussing anatomy and translating Arabic surgical texts. By the 14th century, plague and war would test both systems. Monasteries and hospitals alike struggled to keep up with the scale of illness and death. But that story, too, has its place. The quiet decline of monastic medicine. By the late 14th and into the 15th century, the golden age of the monastic infirmary had begun to dim. The world beyond the cloister was shifting. Cities were growing, universities were expanding, trade routes were opening, and new knowledge, medical, philosophical, and scientific, was flowing into Europe. In this changing landscape, the monastery, once a hub of healing, became a relic of slower, older rhythms. Still, the monastic infirmary did not vanish overnight. In many remote regions, it remained the only medical resource for miles. In others, it persisted out of tradition, supported by generous patrons or embedded within powerful abbeys. But its dominance as a center of healing was waning. This transition was not just about changing institutions. It was about a shift in how health and healing were understood. The monk, with his herbs and prayers, was being replaced by the university-trained physician, who spoke in Latin and carried a growing library of secular medical theory. The rise of urban hospitals and secular healing. The 13th and 14th centuries witnessed the emergence of civic hospitals, institutions sponsored by cities, merchant guilds, or charitable foundations. These were markedly different from monastic infirmaries in both structure and philosophy. Key distinctions included open access to laypeople of all social classes, rather than being primarily reserved for monks or pilgrims. Secular administration, though many still employed religious staff, such as nuns or clergy. Emphasis on acute care, especially for injuries, epidemics, and childbirth. Division of wards based on illness or gender. These hospitals often collaborated with emerging medical faculties, creating a loop of theory and practice. While monks treated through routine and tradition, physicians began testing treatments based on observation, even if still steeped in Galenic theory. Ironically, many civic hospitals were modeled after monastic ones. Same emphasis on cleanliness, same architectural layouts, and same charitable missions. But their secularization marked a significant step toward modern medicine. Challenges to monastic healing: science, skepticism, and plague. Two forces particularly challenged the authority of monastic medicine. The Black Death, 1347–1351. The plague struck monasteries hard. Living in communal settings, monks died in great numbers. Some infirmaries collapsed due to lack of staff. Others were forced to open their doors to desperate townspeople, stretching their already thin resources. While monastic texts prescribed fumigations, herbal teas, and spiritual remedies, these were no match for the pandemic. Mass mortality eroded faith in traditional care, especially care rooted in prayer. The growth of empirical thought. Renaissance thinkers, especially from the 15th century onward, began emphasizing direct observation, anatomy, and experimentation. Figures like Vesalius, Paracelsus and later Harvey broke away from classical doctrines, challenging the old synthesis of medicine and theology. These thinkers valued anatomy over astrology, dissection over doctrine. Monasteries, by contrast, remained anchored in scriptural tradition and symbolic healing. Their refusal to dissect corpses, for example, increasingly set them apart from new medical paradigms. This growing divide widened further with the printing press. Medical texts, once painstakingly copied by monks, now spread rapidly among educated laypeople. The monks' monopoly on literacy and thus on medical transmission was ending. The preservation of botanical knowledge. Despite their declining medical authority, monasteries left a lasting legacy in botanical and herbal knowledge. Their gardens became the blueprint for modern physic gardens and university herbariums. Their manuscripts, like the Herbarium Apuleius, Physica, and Leech books, were copied, adapted, and integrated into early pharmacopoeias. Their methods of preparation, infusions, decoctions, ointments survived in folk medicine and early pharmacy. Even into the 17th and 18th centuries, physicians still referenced monastic herbals. Apothecaries grew many of the same plants monks once tended. Some of the most enduring remedies, like honey for wounds, lavender for calm, and comfrey for bruises, trace their roots to cloister walls. Moreover, in rural areas across Europe, folk healers, many of whom were former monks or nuns, or trained by them, carried this botanical knowledge forward, blending it with local traditions. The shift from care to contemplation. As the centuries turned, monasteries increasingly retreated from medical care, focusing once more on contemplation, prayer, and spiritual service. Some orders, like the Carthusians, had always prioritized isolation. Others, like the Benedictines, maintained limited infirmaries for internal use, but no longer accepted lay patients. Still, a few remained committed to healing. Certain Cistercian and Augustinian houses, especially in Italy and Spain, preserved and even updated their medical practices into the early modern period. Yet for most of Europe, by the 16th century, the monastery was no longer the heart of medicine. Instead, it had become a quiet place of memory of old books, overgrown gardens, and long-practiced rituals slowly fading from the world. The final days of the infirmarian. The infirmarian, once a central figure in the monastery, also faded into obscurity. In his prime, he was a caretaker, cook, herbalist, record-keeper, and spiritual guide. He knew the turning of the seasons, the scent of every leaf, the murmurs of a feverish monk, and the sound of death approaching in the night. By the 17th century, he became mostly a caretaker for the elderly, responsible for easing aging monks toward death with soft hands and silent prayers. His herb room became a store of memory, his scrolls dusty, his role more pastoral than practical. He would not be remembered in the annals of scientific discovery. He would not publish or dissect or teach. But for centuries, he had been the soul of quiet healing, tending wounds the world forgot. A legacy rooted in earth. Though the monastery no longer heals in the same way, its influence is still felt. In the architecture of modern hospitals, modeled after cloisters. In the symbolism of medicine, the cross, the herbal, the gentle caregiver. In the language of healing, words like infirmary, herbal, and even hospital trace back to monastic Latin roots. In the herbal remedies still used in alternative and complementary medicine today. Most importantly, the monastery taught that healing is more than curing. It is comfort, order, care, rhythm, and presence. In the quiet rooms of stone, where chant once echoed and lavender burned, there was a kind of medicine that no scalpel could provide. Final reflection: what we keep and what we leave behind. In the transition from monk to doctor, from garden to laboratory, something was gained but also something lost. The monastery healed slowly, gently, without certainty, but with care. As modern medicine advanced, it raced ahead, sometimes forgetting the quiet voice that once said, "Let us tend the sick as we would tend Christ." In our own era of machines and medication, do we still remember how to sit quietly at a bedside, how to stir a healing broth, or how to see the divine in the act of care? Story 3. A Leper's Life, Surviving the Margins of Medieval Society. Introduction: The tolling bell of isolation. It begins with a mark, perhaps a discolored patch on the skin, a numb finger, a sore that will not heal. In the medieval world, these small bodily signs could become a sentence more terrifying than death itself. A leper once identified was not merely diagnosed. They were declared unclean, separated from society, and in many cases pronounced legally dead. Their belongings were burned, their families distanced, and a bell was placed in their hands, a symbol and a warning. From then on, every step they took through village or forest was announced by its toll. Yet for all the stigma and fear, leprosy, known today as Hansen's disease, did not always mean a life devoid of care or dignity. Throughout the Middle Ages, lepers lived in communities, were granted alms, maintained routines, and in some cases even became symbols of piety and suffering. This story explores what it meant to be marked, rejected, and yet somehow still human in a society shaped by fear, faith, and the fragile hope of healing. What was leprosy really? In medieval texts, the word leprosy was used to describe a wide range of chronic skin conditions, only some of which would match modern Hansen's disease. Leprosy, as we understand it today, is caused by the bacterium Mycobacterium leprae, which affects the skin, nerves, and mucous membranes. It progresses slowly and, if untreated, leads to disfigurement, nerve damage, and loss of sensation. But medieval physicians and clerics didn't diagnose via microscope. They relied on visual observation, moral judgment, and theological reasoning. Common symptoms used to identify leprosy included pale or reddish skin lesions that didn't heal, numbness or insensitivity in the limbs, thickening of the skin, particularly on the face and hands, swelling of the nose or ears, hair loss, especially on eyebrows, hoarseness or nasal disfigurement. These signs were feared not only for their physical implications, but for what they represented. Leprosy was widely believed to be a punishment from God, a visible manifestation of sin, or a consequence of moral corruption. The Church's role in diagnosis and exile. In medieval Europe, the Church did not merely influence perceptions of disease, it defined them. Leprosy, with its disfiguring symptoms, was interpreted through a religious lens, a living death, a form of purgatory on earth. Once suspected, a person would undergo a public diagnosis, often led by a cleric or bishop, and sometimes assisted by a physician. This ritual could involve examination of the body in daylight, often with witnesses, questioning about lifestyle, habits, and even dreams or thoughts, observation of physical signs alongside moral character. If declared a leper, the individual underwent a symbolic funeral rite. They were pronounced dead to the world. Their clothes were replaced with a long robe, often gray or black. A wooden clapper or small bell was issued, to be rung when approaching others. They were forbidden from entering markets, churches, or wells. In some areas, a grave was dug as part of the ritual, symbolizing the death of their social life. It's important to note that not all lepers were exiled permanently. Some remained with families, particularly in rural areas, or lived on the fringes of villages. But the majority were directed to leprosaria, leper hospitals, or colonies designed to remove them from daily society. Life inside the leprosarium. Leprosaria, also called lazarettos, after Lazarus, patron saint of lepers, began appearing across Europe in the 11th and 12th centuries. By the 13th century, they were numerous. England alone had over 100 known leper houses. France and Germany had even more. These institutions were often small, enclosed communities, typically located on the outskirts of towns or near crossroads. They were designed not only for quarantine but for ongoing care, medical, spiritual, and even social. Daily life inside a leprosarium might include shared dormitories, though some had individual cells for advanced cases. Gardens, where residents grew vegetables and herbs. Chapel services, often led by resident priests or visiting clergy. Meals, sometimes prepared communally or delivered from nearby monasteries. Craftwork such as weaving, basket making, or mending. Despite the stigma, many leprosaria were charitable institutions, funded by kings, bishops, or wealthy patrons. Some became wealthy in their own right, owning land and collecting tithes. Residents received alms, sometimes directly from townspeople who viewed donating to lepers as a pious act that earned spiritual merit. Some houses even maintained rules and orders. For example, the leper house of St. Julian near St. Albans followed a modified Benedictine rule, emphasizing prayer, obedience, and service. Legal rights and social status. Being labeled a leper stripped a person of many rights, but not all. In many regions, lepers were allowed to own property, though often administered through a guardian. Permitted to marry, though physical intimacy was discouraged. Able to sue and be sued in court, though often represented by proxies. Granted religious sacraments, albeit outside the main congregation. Entitled to alms, land use, and basic sustenance from local lords. Some towns even set aside designated paths, bridges, or wells for lepers. These accommodations, while separating them, acknowledged their continued personhood. Interestingly, not all lepers were poor. There are records of wealthy lepers donating estates to their leprosaria, effectively buying care and comfort in exchange for charity. Nobles who contracted the disease were sometimes allowed to build private houses near a leper hospital and maintain staff. Saints, suffering, and the theology of leprosy. Though feared, lepers also held a complex symbolic role in Christian theology. They were seen as both punished and holy, living reminders of sin, but also images of Christ's suffering. The story of Lazarus, the beggar covered in sores, was frequently invoked. So too were saints like St. Damien and St. Giles, known for ministering to lepers. Some even believed that ministering to lepers could wash away one's sins, making it a pious act for monks, nuns, and nobles alike. Lepers were, paradoxically, excluded yet elevated. Their suffering placed them closer to the divine. Their isolation mirrored Christ's own rejection. Their wounds were seen as marks not just of disease, but of spiritual trial. This belief softened some of the cruelty. It encouraged care, charity, and dignity, though it could never erase the physical separation they endured. A life lived with limits. Within the walls of the leprosarium, time passed slowly, structured but quiet. The world outside continued its rhythm: markets, festivals, wars, processions. But for those inside, each day followed a pattern of limitation. Even in well-maintained houses, the reality remained that lepers were set apart. They could not participate in public worship or attend fairs. They could not touch those outside the walls. They could not live in town or dine at family tables. Yet this exile was not entirely passive. Within the walls, a kind of community formed of shared loss, shared dignity, and, sometimes, resilience. Lepers organized, formed routines, and found ways to maintain meaning and purpose. Some leprosaria had elected leaders. Others followed semi-monastic rules. Daily life included prayer, gardening, crafting, and often music. There are even records of choirs forming in larger houses. Though removed from society, lepers were not absent from its structures. They were often visible on holy days, when townsfolk brought them food, coins, or alms. Their presence at the margins was a powerful reminder of suffering and charity. Work, worship, and maintenance. Daily life varied by region and the resources of the leprosarium, but most followed a simple structure. Morning prayers were held in chapels or infirmary halls. Meals were served communally, often bread, pottage, and ale. Medicinal routines included salves, herbal washes, and compresses. Some residents helped administer care to one another. Gardening provided both food and herbs. Craftwork baskets, rosaries, textiles was encouraged, offering both occupation and the chance to barter. Housework was shared, sweeping, laundering, cooking, tending the sick. In better endowed houses, care was administered by clerics or lay staff, such as nuns or paid attendants. In poorer houses, residents often cared for each other. It was not unusual for someone with relatively mild symptoms to help feed or dress someone with more advanced disfigurement. Though barred from attending town churches, lepers were not left without faith. Many leprosaria had their own chapels, and some employed a priest to conduct mass and hear confession. Religious observance remained central, both a comfort and a spiritual discipline. Interaction with the outside world. Despite their exile, lepers did not vanish from medieval life. On certain feast days, especially St. Lazarus's Day, lepers were invited into town to receive alms. Some leprosaria set up toll booths or bridges, where passing merchants and pilgrims were obligated to donate. These small taxes became a steady source of income. Pilgrimage was allowed and even encouraged for some. A leper might travel to shrines like St. Thomas Becket's tomb in Canterbury or the Church of St. Mary Magdalene in Vézelay, hoping for miraculous healing. These interactions reinforced a complicated view. Lepers were not entirely removed from society, they were part of it, but only through ritualized, regulated exchanges. They were objects of pity and devotion, but rarely companionship. Protection under the law. Medieval legal systems treated lepers with a mixture of restriction and protection. In England, lepers were often granted letters of protection, shielding them from undue harassment. In France and Italy, certain towns set aside charitable foundations, mandating bread or coin be distributed to lepers on fixed days. Canon law recognized the personhood of lepers, defending their right to property, marriage, and religious observance, albeit at a distance. Interestingly, in some places, violating the rights of lepers, e.g., denying them entry to land they legally owned, could incur fines or penance. This reinforced their paradoxical status, set apart but still protected by the moral order. Still, abuse occurred. Some lepers were attacked or driven away, especially during times of famine or plague, when the sick were feared as scapegoats. In several recorded instances, wandering lepers were accused of poisoning wells or spreading disease and executed. Yet by and large, the medieval system maintained a grim sort of mercy, punishment through exclusion, softened by ritualized care. Leprosy and early treatments. Although no cure for leprosy existed in the Middle Ages, treatment efforts were made particularly within leprosaria and monasteries. Remedies focused on symptom management, comfort, and occasional experimentation. Common treatments included sulfur-based ointments, believed to draw out bad humors from skin lesions. Bloodletting and purging, in keeping with humoral theory, used to balance fluids. Fumigation, burning herbs like rosemary, myrrh, or juniper in the patient's room to purify the air. Soaking limbs in warm baths of vinegar, salt, and plant extracts. Herbal remedies including scabious for skin cleansing, wormwood to dry out corrupt humors, comfrey and mallow for wounds and ulcers. In rare cases, mercury treatments were attempted borrowed from Arabic texts, but with poor results and frequent poisoning. Care was palliative, not curative, but the routines of care, bathing, clean bandaging, Communal meals likely helped many avoid infection or secondary illness. For some, symptoms improved or remained manageable, particularly if their disease had been misdiagnosed. Leprosy and the language of suffering. Over time, leprosy came to represent not just physical illness, but a spiritual metaphor. Church sermons, literature, and poetry often invoked the leper as a symbol of moral corruption, a stand-in for the sinner cast out of grace, a reflection of Christ's own suffering. This dual identity, outcast and martyr, shaped how lepers were treated. They were feared, yes, but also pitied and venerated. Some were even regarded as living saints, their pain a form of divine trial. In religious plays, the leper often appeared as the broken figure who teaches mercy. In miracle stories, healing a leper symbolized redemption and divine forgiveness. This deep symbolic association preserved the leper in Christian imagination long after the disease itself began to decline in Europe. From stigma to sanctity, the holy leper. By the high medieval period, the leper had become more than an outcast, they had become a symbol. Religious and popular literature embraced the image of the leper as the suffering innocent, aligned with Christ in his passion. Stories circulated of lepers refusing comfort, offering prayers for others, and being rewarded in heaven for their patient endurance. These were not just tales, they were shaping public perception and reinforcing the spiritual value of suffering. A famous story told of St. Francis of Assisi, who, as a young man, found himself repulsed by lepers. One day, he forced himself to embrace one on the road. Afterward, he claimed the leper had disappeared and that the act transformed his soul. This moment of spiritual clarity became one of the defining events of Francis's life and cemented the association between lepers and divine humility. In art, lepers appeared alongside saints and martyrs, hunched, disfigured, yet somehow radiant. Their bells and bandages became as iconic as the cross or crown of thorns. And so, paradoxically, while their bodies were pushed to the margins of society, their image remained deeply central to the Christian imagination. The gradual decline of leprosy in Europe. By the late 14th century and into the 15th, cases of leprosy in Europe began to decline. The reasons are still debated by historians and epidemiologists, but several factors likely contributed. A slow disappearance. By the end of the 15th century, leprosy, once a feared and symbolically loaded disease, was beginning to disappear from much of Europe. Its retreat was slow, uneven, and not entirely understood by contemporaries. In earlier centuries, leprosaria had been widespread, particularly during the so-called leprosy explosion of the 12th and 13th centuries. But by the early 1500s, many of these houses were closing, falling into disrepair, or being repurposed. Some were converted into almshouses for the elderly poor. Others became general hospitals, or were absorbed into new religious orders focused on plague care. A few persisted, particularly in remote areas, but the once familiar figure of the leper, clad in a robe and ringing his bell, began to fade from public life. Why? The reasons are debated, but historians point to several contributing factors. Improved hygiene and urban sanitation may have reduced transmission of Mycobacterium leprae. The rise of tuberculosis may have competed with or obscured leprosy, as both diseases target the immune system. Misdiagnosis in earlier periods meant that many cases labeled as leprosy were actually eczema, psoriasis, or other chronic skin conditions. Finally, changing medical theories in the Renaissance reclassified illnesses, often moving away from medieval labels rooted in symbolism and sin. Whatever the causes, leprosy's hold on the European imagination had begun to loosen. From outcast to obsolete. As leprosy declined, so too did the elaborate structures that once defined its place in society. The ritual leper's funeral once a common part of diagnosis, became rare. Clergy grew less likely to enforce separation. Town charters stopped including detailed restrictions on lepers. Almsgiving, once a social and spiritual obligation, shifted toward other forms of poverty relief. With fewer visible cases, society's need to create distance diminished. Ironically, the cultural memory of the leper outlasted the disease itself. Literature, hagiography, and art continued to depict lepers as figures of caution, humility, or divine trial, even as real lepers became increasingly rare. In some cases, this memory was distorted or romanticized. The complex human realities of life in a leprosarium, the boredom, the quiet kindnesses, the internal governance were replaced by stark caricatures: the beggar, the martyr, the penitent. By the early 16th century, leprosy had gone from common fear to cultural echo. What replaced the leper houses? As leprosaria declined, new institutions began to rise shaped by Renaissance ideals, growing cities, and new diseases. Plague hospitals became widespread, particularly during the Black Death and subsequent waves. General hospitals, funded by guilds, nobles, or municipalities, emerged to serve broader public health needs. Secular charity took on a larger role, with almshouses, hospices, and orphanages growing in number. These institutions were less interested in symbolic purity and more concerned with practical care, isolation, and mortality management. The medical profession also evolved. University-trained physicians became increasingly dominant, emphasizing learned theory over religious ritual. Diagnosis shifted from public spectacle to scholarly examination. Leprosy, in this context, no longer fit neatly into the medical or spiritual frameworks of the age. Its patients were absorbed into new categories of illness or simply disappeared from records. The leper abroad. Though leprosy waned in Europe, it did not vanish globally. In fact, during the age of exploration and colonization, European travelers encountered leprosy anew in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, often with fresh confusion and fear. In some cases, they reintroduced medieval concepts, establishing segregated colonies or missionary-run leper hospitals. These efforts, though grounded in religious charity, often reflected colonial attitudes, casting the disease in moral terms. Thus, the medieval European model of leprosy management, quarantine, alms, religious care, persisted in new forms, far from its original context. And even as the leprosaria of Europe crumbled into weeds, their architectural designs, legal codes, and theological justifications continued to shape how the disease was treated elsewhere. Legacy in art and memory. The leper's cultural imprint did not fade quietly. Across literature, painting, and theology, the figure of the leper remained a symbol of loss, humility, and transformation. In medieval plays, lepers were often used to test the compassion of saints, kings, or Christ himself. In illuminated manuscripts, they appear in margins and miniatures, stooped, robed, and ringing at the edges of processions, pleading with outstretched hands. In art, the leper came to represent the fragility of the body, the need for divine mercy, the tension between visibility and invisibility, marked as different, but also hidden away. Modern scholars have begun to recover these lives not as allegories, but as historical subjects. Archaeological digs at leprosarium cemeteries have revealed evidence of long-term care, intentional burial, and community structure. What once seemed a story of shame and exile has become a story of resilience, care, and survival on the margins. What we've forgotten, what we've retained. In today's world, leprosy still exists, but it is treatable, non-contagious once addressed, and far removed from the medieval mythos. Yet echoes remain. The word leper still conjures notions of rejection. Isolation as a public health measure continues to raise ethical questions. The legacy of disease and morality, the idea that illness reveals sin or unworthiness, still shapes public discourse. And most importantly, the medieval leper reminds us of the deep human costs of fear and exclusion, even when paired with mercy. For centuries, Europe built entire systems to manage its lepers, not simply to protect the healthy, but to give shape to suffering. These systems were flawed, sometimes cruel, but they also offered structure, community, and even dignity to those cast aside. Final reflection: a life at the edge. The leper's bell no longer rings in village streets. The robes have faded. The leprosaria are ruins or memories. But their story lingers in the way we treat the sick, the way we define belonging, and the way we respond to that which frightens us. In their silent gardens, their prayers at the margins, their hands that still worked and served despite lost, lepers lived not just marked by disease, but marked by endurance. And in the quiet they left behind, we hear a question still worth asking. Who do we cast out today and why? Story 4. The Urine Wheel, Diagnosing Disease in the Middle Ages. Introduction: a flask of truth. It begins with a bottle narrow-necked, round-bellied, often held to the light of a window or candle. Inside, a fluid of yellow, gold, brown, or red swirls. It is warm. It smells slightly sour. It is urine, and for the medieval physician, it holds the secrets of the body. In an era before thermometers, stethoscopes, or blood tests, the urinal flask was the most essential diagnostic tool. To examine a patient, a doctor didn't necessarily need to see them at all, just their urine. This wasn't superstition. It was uroscopy, the medieval science of diagnosing illness by studying the color, smell, clarity, and even taste of a person's urine. Central to this practice was the urine wheel, a carefully illustrated chart found in countless medical manuscripts, showing a circular array of flasks, each shaded to represent a different hue, with accompanying diagnoses. For centuries, the urine wheel helped guide treatments, shape prognoses, and reinforce the idea that the body, however mysterious, could be understood by reading its most humble output. Uroscopy, the science of medieval diagnosis. To modern minds, the idea of urine reading might sound mystical, but to medieval doctors, it was a structured, evidence-based process rooted in ancient Greek and Roman medicine and elaborated in Arabic and Latin texts. The practice was based on humoral theory, which held that the body was governed by four fluids: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Urine was seen as a waste product of digestion, not just of food, but of all four humors. Its characteristics were believed to reflect the body's internal balance. A trained uroscopist examined. Color: from pale white to deep black. Clarity: clear, cloudy, or sedimented. Smell: sweet, sour, pungent, or putrid. Taste: occasionally sampled for sweetness, especially in diabetes cases. Foam or sediment, seen as signs of fevers, stones, or humoral excesses. Physicians would hold the flask against light, swirl it, compare it to charts, and note its behavior over time. They might consult the patient's astrological chart to interpret their findings more accurately. In this way, urine became not only a diagnostic fluid, but a mirror of the soul and body. The urine wheel, a medieval diagnostic tool. The urine wheel, Latin, circulus urinae, was both a visual reference and a symbol of professional training. Often hand-drawn and painted in vibrant colors, the wheel showed 20 or more flasks, each labeled with Latin descriptors. Typical examples include pallidus pale, often linked to weakness, anemia, or excessive phlegm. Citrinus citrus yellow, seen as healthy, especially in early morning samples. Rubeus red, interpreted as signs of fever or inflammation. Flavus bright yellow, associated with bile or digestive heat. Nigellus black, deeply alarming, often associated with death. Physicians were trained to memorize the wheel's stages and consult it during diagnosis. In a period when few people could read, the wheel also functioned as a didactic image, a teaching tool for students and apprentices. In some cases, the wheel was bound into medical compendia. In others, it was painted on walls or copied into notebooks. Its circular shape wasn't arbitrary, it echoed cosmic harmony, linking bodily function to celestial influence. The physician and the flask. By the 13th century, the image of a learned physician holding a urine flask had become iconic. He appeared in manuscripts, woodcuts, and paintings bearded, robed, gazing thoughtfully at the golden liquid. This was not just medical imagery, it was branding. Physicians used the flask to distinguish themselves from barber surgeons and folk healers. The ability to read urine was seen as a mark of education, one rooted in the study of Hippocrates, Galen, and later Avicenna. In many cities, patients would bring their flask to the physician's home or office. A full examination might not require a physical meeting. The doctor would assess the urine, ask questions through an intermediary, and write out a diagnosis and prescription. This was especially helpful for female patients, who were often reluctant or forbidden to be examined in person. In such cases, urine offered a modest alternative to physical inspection. Influential texts on uroscopy. The study of urine analysis had a rich textual tradition. Theophilus Protospatarius, a 7th century Byzantine writer, composed one of the earliest works on urine classification. Isaac Israeli, a 9th century Jewish physician from North Africa, wrote extensively on urine as a diagnostic method. Constantine the African, in the 11th century, translated Arabic medical texts into Latin, spreading uroscopy across Western Europe. Gilles de Corbel, a 12th century physician, composed a poem on uroscopy de urinis, which was used in medical education for generations. These works were copied, taught, and commented upon for centuries. Some manuscripts included detailed diagrams, flasks with labeled layers, and even marginalia noting unusual cases. The prestige of uroscopy was such that even unlicensed healers sought to mimic it, leading to conflicts between licensed physicians and piss prophets. Itinerant diagnostician who offered cheap interpretations of urine flasks in markets and taverns. The method behind the medicine. For the medieval physician, uroscopy wasn't guesswork, it was systematic. A diagnosis based on urine involved careful observation, adherence to established medical doctrine, and often theological interpretation. The steps were consistent across regions and centuries. Collection. Urine was ideally collected in the morning, when bodily processes were thought to be most balanced. The container, often a matula, a glass flask with a round base, was carefully cleaned and kept at room temperature to prevent condensation or distortion. Examination of qualities. The physician would then assess color from pale straw to dark black, consistency, watery, oily, foamy, thick, clarity, transparent, cloudy, or with sediment, smell, pleasant, sour, pungent, or putrid, taste, rare but practiced. Sweet taste could indicate honey sickness, likely diabetes mellitus. Layered interpretation. Urine was often analyzed in zones. Top layer, froth or bubbles, signs of fever or excess heat. Middle layer, overall color linked to humoral imbalances. Bottom layer, sediment suggested kidney issues or infections. Physicians referenced the urine wheel or uroscopy manuals, often cross-referencing with the patient's age, gender, diet, sleep patterns, pulse, if taken, and sometimes even dreams or astrological conditions. In complex cases, they might also examine stool, sputum, or sweat, but urine remained the gold standard of medieval internal diagnostics. The influence of astrology. Astrology was an ever-present force in medieval life, and uroscopy was no exception. It was believed that the moon and planets affected the body's humors, just as they influenced tides and crops. A physician might consult the astrological chart of the patient before interpreting the urine. The moon in Cancer was thought to increase fluid retention. Mars in Scorpio might correspond to inflammation and red urine. A waning moon might indicate declining health, especially if urine was dark or murky. Some physicians delayed diagnosis until the stars aligned properly for clear interpretation. Others used the position of planets to schedule treatments, believing that bleeding or purging should only occur under favorable celestial conditions. This was not viewed as superstition, but as natural philosophy, a belief that the microcosm, the body, mirrored the macrocosm, the heavens. The physician's practice, status, and performance. In the eyes of the medieval public, the physician was not merely a healer but a learned man trained in universities, fluent in Latin, and often employed by nobility. His ability to read urine became a sign of his sophistication. In major cities, physicians rarely visited patients in person. Instead, a messenger, often a servant or family member, would deliver a matula to the physician's home. There, the doctor would hold it to a window, refer to his urine chart, and provide a diagnosis and prescription, often written in Latin. This process elevated uroscopy to an intellectual exercise, reinforcing the physician's status over more hands-on practitioners like barber surgeons or herbalists. In some cases, patients would carry multiple flasks to different physicians, comparing results, a medieval form of second opinion. Wealthier patients might request custom-made flasks, etched with initials or symbols, adding status to even this bodily function. Piss profits in popular practice. As the prestige of uroscopy grew, so did its imitators. Piss prophets, unlicensed urine readers, traveled from town to town, offering affordable and often dramatic diagnoses to the poor. They set up stalls in marketplaces, claiming to divine illness, fate, and even infidelity from the contents of a flask. While physicians scorned these practitioners as frauds, many commoners trusted them. After all, they charged less, spoke the vernacular, and often offered folk remedies rooted in local tradition. Authorities occasionally cracked down on such prophets, especially when their advice contradicted established medical teaching or when patients died under their care. Nevertheless, the piss prophet remained a fixture of medieval life, a reminder that medicine was not only a science but a performance, where confidence, language, and spectacle mattered as much as training. Women's secrecy and the diagnostic distance. In a culture where physical modesty was tightly guarded, especially for women, uroscopy offered a rare opportunity for diagnosis without touch. This was particularly important for upper-class women, who might never be examined physically by a male physician. Instead, their chambermaid or steward would bring a matula to the doctor. This diagnostic distance preserved propriety while allowing for care. It also introduced a layer of complexity. The physician often had no direct access to the patient's demeanor, breathing, complexion, or other physical signs. He was dependent entirely on the urine, as well as second-hand descriptions. Despite the limitation, many physicians claimed they could diagnose pregnancy, fertility problems, hysteria, melancholy, or menstruation issues through urine alone. While not always accurate, this method was widely accepted and praised for allowing women to receive care while maintaining social decorum. Treatment based on urine. Once the urine was examined, treatment recommendations would follow, typically focused on restoring humoral balance. Examples included bloodletting, often prescribed if urine was reddish, hot, or foamy, indicating excess blood or bile. Purgatives, bitter herbs or minerals given to cleanse the body of excess black bile or phlegm. Dietary adjustments. Patients were told to eat cool or moist foods such as lettuce, barley, or dairy, depending on the diagnosis. Bathing and sweating, induced with hot herbs like thyme or mustard seed to expel internal heat or toxins. Herbal tonics, including ingredients like wormwood, hyssop, fennel, or sage. Treatment could last days or weeks, and urine was often re-examined at intervals to track improvement. If the color changed, growing clearer or lighter, it was seen as a sign of healing. If it darkened or thickened, the prognosis might turn grim. The cracks in the flask begin to show. For centuries, uroscopy reigned as a cornerstone of medieval diagnosis. The flask was sacred, the urine wheel a guide, and the body a book that could be read if only one knew the language of humors, colors, and celestial signs. But by the late 15th and early 16th centuries, cracks had begun to show in that glass flask both literally and metaphorically. Europe was changing. The Renaissance brought a new emphasis on direct observation, dissection, and experimentation. Human anatomy was no longer just something inferred from texts, it was something that could be seen, drawn, measured, and even challenged. The result was a slow but steady erosion of confidence in purely interpretive methods like uroscopy. New knowledge challenges old beliefs. One of the most decisive blows came from Andreas Vesalius, whose 1543 anatomical masterpiece De Humani Corporis Fabrica shattered centuries of blind adherence to Galen. Vesalius showed that Galen had made errors, many of them, and that real knowledge came from cutting into the human body, not relying solely on fluids and flasks. Around the same time, Paracelsus, the maverick Swiss physician and alchemist, publicly attacked uroscopy. He called it superstitious, overly theoretical, and too reliant on what he considered guesswork. Paracelsus believed that disease came from external agents, not imbalanced humors. His insistence on chemical remedies and environmental causes pulled medicine further away from the urine wheel and toward what we might now call toxicology and pathology. Although traditionalists resisted, their hold weakened with each passing decade. The rise of experimental medicine. By the 17th century, a new kind of medicine was taking root. Physicians and natural philosophers began to emphasize quantifiable observation, measuring pulse, recording temperature, timing symptoms. Microscopy. Following the invention of the microscope, physicians could now see tiny structures in blood, pus, and urine that defied earlier humoral theories. Clinical experience. The bedside manner shifted from symbolism and theory to case history, symptom tracking, and post-mortem findings. Uroscopy, while still practiced, increasingly became a secondary method. It could suggest problems, but it was no longer the foundation for diagnosis. The urine wheel, once a symbol of medical literacy, became a curiosity, a decorative page in old texts, a relic of a more allegorical age. Regulation, skepticism, and the fall of the piss prophet. Even the lower-tier practitioners of uroscopy, the so-called piss prophets, found themselves under fire. As medical guilds and licensing bodies solidified, particularly in cities like London and Paris, unauthorized diagnosis was outlawed. The image of the itinerant urine reader, once a familiar market figure, became associated with quackery and fraud. Pamphlets and broadsheets in the 17th and 18th centuries lampooned these figures. One English poem mocked a prophet of the pot, whose diagnoses changed with the weather. Another print showed a man reading urine under a full moon, consulting a star chart, while a patient looked on in fear. The public began to see urine diagnosis as outdated at best, deceptive at worst. Still, some rural areas clung to the tradition, especially where licensed doctors were scarce or unaffordable. For many, the ritual of urine inspection, no matter how imprecise, felt more trustworthy than the sterile distance of emerging medical science. What remained? The enduring symbolism of urine. Despite its decline as a diagnostic tool, urine never lost its symbolic and practical role in medicine entirely. In fact, even as uroscopy faded, urine continued to serve several important functions. Testing for diabetes. Physicians in the early modern period rediscovered the sweet taste of diabetic urine, and this remained one of the few diagnostic uses of taste in medical history. Urinalysis. Though not formalized until the 19th century, physicians continued to examine urine for clarity and sediment when diagnosing kidney or bladder issues. Ritual cleansing. In some folk traditions, urine retained healing or protective qualities, especially when combined with herbs or fasting. The Matula flask, meanwhile, remained a visual emblem of the physician well into the modern period. In portraits, seals, and carvings, doctors were still depicted holding flasks, a sign of their training, not necessarily their daily practice. Today, the symbol persists in some pharmacy signs, heraldry, and institutional logos, a ghost of the golden liquid that once guided so much of medieval thought. Modern echoes of an ancient art. Strangely enough, urine would return to the forefront of diagnosis not through color wheels, but through chemical analysis. In the 19th century, advances in organic chemistry allowed doctors to detect glucose, proteins, and blood in urine with increasing accuracy. In the 20th century, dipstick testing and urinalysis machines brought precision back to the matula, now updated with science rather than symbolism. Today, urine is used to test for everything from pregnancy and kidney disease to drug use and infection. And so, in a way, the medieval physicians were not wrong to consider urine a window into the body. They simply lacked the tools we now have to interpret what they saw. Their mistake wasn't in looking, but in assuming that color alone could explain it all. Final reflection, what the flask still teaches us. In the flickering light of a 13th century candle, a physician holds a glass flask to the window. He squints. The liquid swirls. Outside, a patient waits, hopeful, fearful, unaware that his life may depend on how that golden fluid is read. The urine wheel spins no longer, but its legacy remains. It reminds us of a time when medicine was as much art as science, when symbols filled the void left by ignorance, and when physicians searched for truth using the only tools they had: eyes, hands, and belief. And perhaps more importantly, it asks a question that still lingers. When we look into the body for answers, are we ever just reading what we want to see? Story 5, Bloodletting and Balance, the Theory of the Four Humors. Introduction, the Medicine of Equilibrium. Imagine your body as a scale, delicate, dynamic, and constantly shifting. Now imagine that every symptom you experience, fever, sadness, anger, fatigue, is not an isolated event, but a sign that something within this scale has tipped. This was the foundational belief of humoral theory, the guiding system of medicine for nearly 2 millennia. At its core were the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Each fluid corresponded to elements of the cosmos, qualities of temperature and moisture, and even aspects of human personality. Health meant balance, disease meant imbalance, and the goal of medicine was to restore equilibrium, often through methods as invasive as bloodletting, as dietary as fasting, or as gentle as changing your mood. In medieval Europe, this ancient framework shaped every diagnosis, every prescription, every whispered prayer over a sickbed. To be healed was not just to be cleansed or stitched, it was to be rebalanced, like the earth after a storm. But how did this system come to dominate Western medicine so completely? And why, despite its flaws, did it feel so convincing for so long? The ancient origins of the humoral system. The theory of the four humors wasn't born in the Middle Ages. Its origins stretch back to ancient Greece, most notably to the physician Hippocrates, 5th century BCE, who proposed that bodily fluids governed health. His follower, Galen of Pergamon, 2nd century CE, expanded the idea into a vast, intricate medical system. According to Galen, blood hot and wet was linked to air in spring. Phlegm cold and wet was linked to water in winter. Yellow bile hot and dry was linked to fire in summer. Black bile cold and dry was linked to earth in autumn. These substances moved through the body and were produced by specific organs, the liver, brain, spleen, and gallbladder. When they remained in harmony, a person thrived. When one became excessive or deficient, illness resulted. Galen's writings were encyclopedic, blending anatomy, physiology, psychology, astrology, and theology. His influence was so pervasive that medieval medicine often used Galenic and medical interchangeably. His ideas were translated, preserved, and commented upon by Islamic scholars, including Avicenna and Rhazes, whose works later re-entered Europe through Latin translations, especially in Spain and Italy. By the time of the 12th century, humoral theory was not merely a medical system, it was a worldview. Diagnosing through the humors. In the medieval clinic or castle chamber, or monastic infirmary, the diagnosis of disease nearly always involved an evaluation of humoral imbalance. Physicians were taught to read the patient not as a collection of symptoms, but as a landscape of excesses and deficits. If you had fever and flushed cheeks, right arrow, too much blood, sanguine. Lethargy, pale complexion, excess phlegm, phlegmatic. Aggression, jaundiced eyes, right arrow, overflow of yellow bile, choleric. Sadness, dark circles under the eyes, right arrow, excess black bile, melancholic. But diagnosis went deeper than this. Practitioners considered pulse and heartbeat rhythms, color and consistency of urine and stool, mood, dreams, diet, and even recent emotional events. Astrological charts, linking planetary alignments to humoral shifts. Once a diagnosis was made, the treatment was logical: reverse the excess or strengthen the lacking. The physician, in effect, acted as a balancer of inner tides. The four temperaments, personality, and the humors. Humoral theory didn't just explain sickness, it explained personality. Each humor was tied to a temperament, a model of behavior and emotion. Sanguine blood, right arrow, cheerful, sociable, optimistic, but easily distracted. Phlegmatic phlegm, right arrow, calm, reliable, passive, slow to anger. Choleric yellow bile, right arrow, ambitious, decisive, passionate, quick-tempered. Melancholic black bile, right arrow, introspective, artistic, perfectionist, often depressed. People were thought to be born with a dominant humor, but life events, climate, diet, and spiritual habits could shift one's balance. This meant that a person's health, personality, and fate were deeply intertwined. The idea of the four temperaments wasn't restricted to physicians. It appeared in literature, art, court politics, and even theology. A choleric king might be praised for his vigor or warned against tyranny. A melancholic poet might be admired for depth or pitied for imbalance. The humoral model, in this way, shaped how medieval people understood themselves and one another far beyond the sickroom. Bloodletting, the knife as a cure. Of all the methods used to balance the humors, none was more emblematic or controversial than bloodletting. When a physician diagnosed an excess of blood, often seen in fevers, flushed skin, restlessness, the standard prescription was to remove it. This was done either through venesection, opening a vein with a small blade; scarification, superficial cuts to release minor amounts; cupping, using heated glass or horn cups to draw blood to the surface, sometimes after incising the skin; leeching, applying medicinal leeches to draw blood gradually. Where the blood was taken from mattered. Physicians followed detailed charts, choosing veins based on symptoms. For headaches, blood might be drawn from the forehead. for liver problems from the arm, for lung congestion from the chest or under the tongue. Timing also mattered. Bloodletting was coordinated with moon phases, zodiac signs, and planetary hours. Physicians believed the body's humors flowed in cycles, rising and falling with the stars. Though we now recognize the risks of bloodletting weakening the body, spreading infection in the medieval mind, it was a precise tool, applied thoughtfully and deliberately. Humoral prescriptions, beyond the blade. Bloodletting was dramatic, but most humoral treatments were everyday measures meant to reshape the body gently over time. Physicians commonly prescribed dietary changes. Foods were classified by humor. For instance, chicken and bread were hot and moist, ideal for melancholics. Lettuce and cucumbers were cold and moist, good for cholerics. Regimen, adjustments to sleep, exercise, and emotional states. Bathing and herbal infusions, to sweat out excesses or soothe imbalances. Fasting or controlled vomiting and purging, to cleanse the digestive system and reset humoral flow. Aromatherapy and music, used to calm a choleric or lift a melancholic. Prayer and confession, for disorders seen as moral or spiritual in origin. This approach to care was deeply individualized. Two patients with the same fever might receive different prescriptions depending on their age, body type, season of the year, or dominant humor. A system of diagnosis rooted in belief. To fully understand the endurance of humoral medicine, one must remember this. It was not merely a theory, it was a lens for understanding the entire world. Medicine, personality, behavior, whether morality, even spirituality were, in the medieval mind, interconnected by the principle of balance and correspondence. Just as the universe consisted of four elements: earth, water, fire, and air, the body contained four humors. As the seasons cycled, so did the dominance of humors in the body. In spring, blood surged. In summer, yellow bile. Autumn brought black bile, and winter favored phlegm. A person's health waxed and waned with the seasons. This was a worldview that explained both the body and its context. Disease wasn't an external invasion, it was the result of internal imbalance, often triggered by improper lifestyle or environmental disturbance. Recovery wasn't just about medicine, it was about restoring cosmic and bodily harmony. Bloodletting as ritual and routine. Of all the humoral treatments, bloodletting occupied the most visible and dramatic place. It was ritualistic, precise, and surprisingly common, so much so that it was often performed prophylactically, even in the absence of illness. Patients might be bled seasonally to prevent buildup of a humor, before surgery to calm the blood and reduce complications, during menstruation if a woman was considered to have blocked or insufficient flow, in times of melancholy to purge black bile from the system. Barber surgeons often performed the procedure, especially in towns. Physicians chose the vein and volume, while the barber provided the skill with the blade. The ubiquitous red and white barber pole, that originates from this very practice: red for blood, white for the bandage. In larger cities, bleeding charts were posted on infirmary walls. They advised on the best dates and veins to use depending on the patient's symptoms and the season. In monasteries, monks were bled on a rotating schedule, typically 4 times a year, to maintain spiritual and physical balance. The tools of the trade. The instruments of bloodletting were as important as the act itself. Fleams, small hinged knives used for venesection. Lancets, slender, double-edged blades designed for precise cuts. Scarificators, multi-bladed devices that could create dozens of small punctures at once. Cupping vessels, glass or horn, often heated to draw blood to the surface before or after incision. Leeches, collected from marshes, kept in jars, and applied to sensitive areas like behind the ears, eyelids, or inner thighs. Leeches, in particular, were believed to be gentle and precise, removing impure blood without disturbing the body's core vitality. Apothecaries even sold medicinal leeches, and manuals described how to care for and reuse them. Some towns maintained public leech ponds, as demand could outstrip supply. Patients might feel faint or dizzy during bloodletting, expected signs that the humoral excess was leaving the body. If a patient grew pale, the physician might nod with approval. The imbalance departs. Recovery after bloodletting. After a bloodletting, care was often prescribed to aid in rebalancing the body. Patients were told to rest in a warm, dry room, avoid wine or meat for a day or two, drink broths, often made with fennel or barley, pray, particularly in monasteries, to thank God for the release of corrupted blood. In some traditions, the act of bloodletting had spiritual overtones. Just as Christ shed blood for humanity, so too might a patient's bleeding represent a cleansing both physical and moral. This fusion of theology and physiology was deeply characteristic of medieval thinking. Manuals and texts preserving the practice. Medical texts of the Middle Ages, often written in Latin or Arabic, contained detailed illustrations of the veins to be used in bloodletting. Some even included poems or mnemonics to help students remember which vein matched which disease. One of the most common was the vein man, a diagram of the human body overlaid with lines and labels, each corresponding to a different vein and ailment. For example, vein in the right arm, bled for headaches and fevers. Vein in the ankle, used for gout and leg pains. Veins in the temple, reserved for eye diseases or mental disturbances. These manuals were copied by hand in universities, monasteries, and clinics. They reflected an understanding of the body that was both visual and symbolic, where veins were not just vessels, but gateways to restoring harmony. Psychological interpretations. Beyond the physical act, the humoral system also provided psychological explanations. This was especially true in cases of mental illness, which were often viewed through the lens of black bile. A melancholic patient withdrawn, sad, given to contemplation was not only sick, but also considered temperamentally predisposed to their state. Treatments included herbal tonics like St. John's wort or valerian, exposure to sunlight and fresh air, music therapy, especially soft string instruments or chanting, cleansing rituals, including mild purges or even confession. Sometimes bloodletting was applied, but gently. The idea was not to shock the body, but to nudge the humors back into place. This approach, while lacking modern neurobiology, shows a surprising early awareness of psychosomatic health, recognizing the interdependence of body, mood, and mind. Regional variations in humoral practice. While the framework of the four humors was widely accepted, regional customs added their own flavor. In Islamic medicine, for instance, Ibn Sina Avicenna described over 60 different types of pulse, each tied to humoral changes. His canon of medicine synthesized Greek, Persian, and Indian traditions and remained authoritative well into the 17th century. In Christian Europe, the Church often infused medical theory with moral lessons. Gluttony, anger, lust each was linked to humoral imbalance, and repentance was considered part of healing. In Jewish medical communities, humoral ideas were often adapted to align with ritual purity laws, especially in relation to blood and bodily fluids. Jewish physicians like Isaac Israeli bridged the Greco-Arabic and Latin worlds, teaching through analogies, parables, and case studies. Thus, while the theory remained intact, its application varied, revealing how medicine adapted itself to cultural and spiritual contexts. The slow erosion of a medical orthodoxy. By the dawn of the 17th century, the theory of the four humors had ruled Western and Islamic medicine for over a millennium. It had shaped not only treatment but identity. It defined how people understood their emotions, their bodies, and their fates. But even the most enduring frameworks eventually meet their limits. The humoral theory's first major challenge came not from physicians, but from anatomists and natural philosophers, individuals who looked inside the body not for symbols, but for structures and mechanisms. When Andreas Vesalius published De Humani Corporis Fabrica in 1543, it signaled a new kind of medicine, one grounded in direct observation, dissection, and the careful study of the organs and systems, rather than fluids and temperaments. Vesalius corrected Galen's anatomical errors and exposed the assumptions made from animal dissection, which had formed the basis of medieval medicine. The result was a growing sense that perhaps the body didn't operate solely on balance and excess, but on function and failure, a mechanical system rather than a philosophical one. The decline of bloodletting. The practice of bloodletting, once so universal, began to decline, though not all at once. In the 17th and 18th centuries, many physicians still performed venesection. It remained popular in royal courts and military hospitals, but doubts were mounting. Some physicians began keeping casebooks and found no consistent benefit. Patients began to resist, especially when bloodletting left them weaker or disoriented. Critics questioned why some patients improved after being bled, while others died. By the late 18th century, the practice was under increasing scrutiny. Enlightenment thinkers called for empirical evidence, and slowly, the belief in humoral causes faded. But it was the 19th century that delivered the final blows. Pierre Louis, a French physician, conducted early statistical studies showing that bloodletting offered no real advantage in treating pneumonia. The rise of germ theory, led by figures like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, provided a radically different explanation for disease: external pathogens, not internal imbalances. Advances in microscopy allowed scientists to see bacteria, white blood cells, and tissues, none of which aligned with humoral models. By the end of the 1800s, bloodletting had become largely symbolic. In mainstream medicine, it was abandoned or drastically restricted. Only a few conditions like polycythemia vera, a rare blood disorder, still justified the practice. And with it, the entire theory of the four humors quietly receded into history. Theories replaced but not forgotten. Though humoralism is no longer practiced as science, its cultural footprint endures. The four temperaments, sanguine, melancholic, choleric, phlegmatic, still appear in personality models, literature, and popular psychology. The word melancholy still evokes black bile, while phlegmatic suggests a calm, cool temperament. Bloodletting remains a powerful metaphor in stories of sacrifice, balance, or self-purification. Modern integrative and alternative medicine, too, occasionally echoes humoral thinking. Ideas about hot and cold foods, energetic balance, and bodily constitution types can be found in Ayurveda, traditional Chinese medicine, and even Western herbalism. These systems, like Galenic medicine, view the body as a complex, interdependent whole, where symptoms reflect not just disease but deeper disharmony. Lessons from the humors. Looking back, it's easy to dismiss humoral theory as misguided and outdated relic of pre-scientific thought, but to do so misses its deeper significance. The theory endured for so long because it offered something compelling: a sense of order in a chaotic world, a moral dimension to health where virtue, diet, and emotion mattered, a system that made sense of suffering, even if it couldn't always cure it. More importantly, humoralism teaches us something about the nature of medical knowledge. All theories are products of their time. They emerge from the best available evidence, shaped by culture, language, and belief. Certainty is not the same as truth. For centuries, physicians were absolutely sure that bleeding a feverish patient was wise. They were wrong but sincere. Compassion often survives bad science. Despite its flaws, humoral medicine was practiced with care. Physicians took time with patients, tailored treatments, and viewed health as holistic. Science evolves, but human needs remain. Whether using a lancet or a stethoscope, physicians today still aim to interpret signs, restore balance, and ease suffering. 1,000 years ago, a physician might open a vein to calm a mind, ease a fever, or please the stars. His tools were simple, his methods archaic, but his intent was familiar. He was trying to understand a body in pain, trying to interpret signals from within, trying to balance what could not yet be measured. And so we ask, in our modern rush for data, speed, and certainty, what do we risk forgetting about the human need for meaning in medicine? Story 6. The Barber Surgeons, Haircuts, Amputations, and Everything in Between. A blade for every need. In today's world, it would be unthinkable to get a haircut and an amputation from the same person. But in medieval Europe, this pairing was entirely normal, expected, even. For centuries, the most common medical professionals were not physicians trained in universities or cloistered monks in herbal gardens. They were barber surgeons, practical men with sharp blades, steady hands, and a willingness to work where others would not. The barber surgeon was a jack of all trades, performing minor surgical procedures, pulling teeth, lancing abscesses, bloodletting, setting bones, and yes, trimming beards and cutting hair. In towns large and small, they were among the most accessible medical practitioners. They filled the wide space between the university-trained physician and the unlicensed folk healer. And on battlefields, they were often the only line of defense against death by infection, bleeding, or crushed bone. Their trade was born out of necessity, shaped by war, constrained by hierarchy, and always marked by blood. The division of medical labor. To understand how barber surgeons rose to prominence, one must first understand the strict division of labor in medieval medicine. Physicians, highly educated, trained at universities, often fluent in Latin and Greek. They diagnosed diseases, studied ancient texts, and prescribed treatments, but they rarely, if ever, touched a patient with a blade. Surgeons, initially considered manual laborers rather than scholars. Surgery was regarded as a craft, not an intellectual pursuit. Barbers, trained in grooming, but also experienced with razors, scalpels, and cleanliness tools that easily transitioned into surgical uses. The physician might tell a patient they needed bloodletting, but would not perform it. The barber surgeon would do it and stitch the wound afterward. This practical overlap between grooming and minor surgery gave rise to a professional hybrid. By the 12th century, barber surgeons were recognized in cities across Europe. In many places, they organized into guilds, gaining a degree of legal protection and respect. Still, their position remained ambiguous, essential but lower class, revered in times of crisis, ignored in times of peace. Surgery on the battlefield. Perhaps nowhere was the barber surgeon more indispensable than on the battlefield. In the muddy fields of the 100 Years' War, the Crusades, and countless local skirmishes, wounds were common and deadly. Weapons of the time inflicted crushing blows, ragged cuts, and bone-shattering trauma. Infection was almost inevitable. The barber surgeon's role included amputating limbs damaged beyond repair, often with crude saws, removing arrows barbed or broken, sometimes buried deep in flesh, staunching bleeding with hot irons, cauterization, or tightly bound tourniquets, lancing boils and cleaning wounds with wine, vinegar, or brine. Speed was crucial. There were no anesthetics, no sterilized rooms. A patient might be held down by assistants while the surgeon worked, his tools rinsed in wine between procedures. Screams were common, and the line between survival and death thin. These experiences honed the barber surgeon's skill under pressure. While physicians theorized about humors, The barber surgeon dealt with what was in front of him and what might kill his patient in the next 10 minutes. Bloodletting and the barbers. One of the most routine procedures performed by barber surgeons was bloodletting, a mainstay of medieval humoral medicine. Unlike physicians, who diagnosed when and why blood should be drawn, the barber surgeon actually did it. The patient would be seated, the chosen vein tied off with a cloth, and the area cleaned. A fleam or lancet would pierce the skin just deep enough to draw blood, not sever tendons. The blood would flow into a basin, often measured against expectations from humoral texts. Sometimes the patient was faint afterward. Sometimes they were declared rebalanced. The barber surgeon would wash the wound, apply a cloth bandage, and return the patient home. And if the patient died, it was rarely the barber surgeon who was blamed. It was the imbalance of humors or the will of God. Their association with this practice gave rise to one of the most recognizable symbols in medical history, the barber pole. The red stripes represent blood, the white bandages, the pole itself, a stylized version of the staff patients gripped during bloodletting to help veins swell. Barber surgeon guilds and regulation. In time, barber surgeons organized themselves into guilds, particularly in major cities like London, Paris, and Florence. These guilds allowed practitioners to establish training standards, including apprenticeships, regulate fees and services, preventing undercutting or fraud, present a unified front to civic authorities. In London, the Company of Barber Surgeons was formed in 1540 by royal charter from Henry VIII, combining the Fellowship of Surgeons and the Worshipful Company of Barbers. The union was partly pragmatic, uniting two craftspeople working similar roles but also symbolic, an elevation of surgery's status. In France, the École de Chirurgie eventually offered formal training in surgery, allowing barber surgeons to rise in status, but only if they followed strict educational paths. Still, despite these efforts, barber surgeons remained below university-educated physicians in the medical hierarchy. They were considered men of the hand, not the mind. Cleanliness and the surgeon's trade. One of the overlooked aspects of the barber surgeon's profession was their commitment to cleanliness, long before the discovery of germs. Barbers were expected to keep blades sharp and polished, clean instruments with boiled water or wine, wear linen aprons to protect from bloodstains, use soap and warm water to wash hands and basins. While this was not sterilization in the modern sense, it did reduce infection, especially compared to folk healers who used dirtier tools or home remedies. In monasteries and wealthier households, barber surgeons sometimes even used silver or brass instruments, which had mild antimicrobial effects. Their practical, no-nonsense approach, coupled with relatively hygienic habits, meant that some barber surgeons had better patient survival rates than their more learned counterparts. The rise of medical professionalism. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Europe was entering a new phase of intellectual revival. Universities were expanding, trade was flourishing, and the early tremors of the Renaissance were beginning to reshape how people understood the human body. Physicians university-trained and steeped in Galenic theory began a push for greater professional recognition. They viewed themselves as men of science, aligned with the church, nobility, and scholarly tradition. As such, they began to distance themselves from surgery, which they still considered a manual, lower-class activity. This distinction between physician and surgeon became more than just a question of education. It was a matter of status and control, and the barber surgeons were caught squarely in the middle. Surgical knowledge versus social class. As knowledge of anatomy and surgery advanced thanks in part to battlefield experience and some daring dissections, barber surgeons found themselves possessing valuable practical expertise that many university physicians lacked entirely. But the structure of society and medicine made it difficult for that expertise to be formally recognized. In many European cities, barber surgeons were barred from lecturing at universities. Their guilds were subordinate to those of physicians. They could not write or publish treatises without the approval of a learned physician. Yet despite these restrictions, their importance was undeniable. They continued to serve the public, especially the poor and middle classes, because their services were accessible, effective, and immediate. Some barber surgeons even began challenging the system. Knowledge from the battlefield. The battlefield remained one of the few places where barber surgeons could rise by merit. There, far from university halls, necessity drove innovation. One of the most famous examples of this was Ambroise Paré, a 16th-century French barber surgeon who revolutionized surgical treatment through sheer experience. Paré began his career as an apprentice to a barber, later serving as an army surgeon. At that time, it was common practice to cauterize gunshot wounds with boiling oil, under the belief that gunpowder poisoned the wound and heat would neutralize it. One day, Paré ran out of oil and improvised with a gentler salve of egg yolk, rose oil, and turpentine. To his surprise, the patients treated with the salve fared much better than those who had been burned. This moment of accidental innovation led Paré to reject cauterization in favor of ligatures thread used to tie off arteries during amputations, something revolutionary at the time. Paré wrote and published extensively, with considerable pushback from academic physicians, helping to elevate surgery to a more respected, evidence-based field. Yet he never abandoned his barber surgeon identity, training the next generation. As the centuries wore on, barber surgeons began to organize their own apprenticeship programs. A young man aspiring to become a barber surgeon would begin as an apprentice, learning to shave, pull teeth, and lance boils. Progress to assisting with bloodletting, wound cleaning, and minor surgeries. Eventually take on more complex procedures, especially if serving with the military. Training manuals, many handwritten and copied across towns, began to circulate. These included illustrated guides on venous systems for bloodletting, bone-setting techniques for broken limbs, tooth extraction methods, including the use of forceps and herbal mouth rinses. Guilds oversaw the certification of barber surgeons and set the conditions under which they could legally practice. In some regions, barbers who wished to perform surgeries needed a license from the crown or town council. By the 16th century, barber surgeons occupied a curious place, highly skilled, deeply embedded in public life, but still officially inferior to their physician counterparts. Barbering as public service. Even beyond surgery, the role of the barber was far more important than we might imagine today. In the absence of daily bathing, barbers provided scalp and hair treatments to reduce lice and dandruff, facial cleaning and oiling for men, especially before formal events, cleansing with herbal infusions, especially important for monks and nobles, who were expected to maintain grooming despite rarely bathing fully, ear cleaning, beard trimming, and even minor dentistry. In towns, the barber's shop was a hub of local gossip, medical advice, and practical care. For the working classes, barber surgeons were often the only people available for real health concerns. While physicians debated theory in Latin, the barber surgeon was on the street, treating wounds, listening to pain, and pulling aching teeth. Royal patronage and greater recognition. As monarchs began forming standing armies and expanding state bureaucracy, they recognized the value of skilled barber surgeons, not just for soldiers but for court life. Some barber surgeons received royal patronage and were appointed as royal surgeons to the king or queen, chief military surgeons overseeing care for thousands of troops, court barbers expected to both groom and perform small surgical procedures as needed. In these cases, the line between barber and surgeon began to blur. Their proximity to power gave them influence but also increased tensions with physicians, who often viewed these appointments as usurping academic privilege. The conflict between practice and theory, hand and mind, only grew more pronounced. A profession splits apart. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the pressures that had built between academic physicians and practical barber surgeons began to reach a critical point. Scientific inquiry was changing. Anatomical studies were becoming central to medical understanding. Public dissection demonstrations, which had once been rare and regulated, were now increasingly conducted in medical theaters, often open to students and the public alike. Surgery, once considered a lowly manual craft, was being reimagined as a scientific discipline, and barber surgeons, with their apprenticeships and trade guilds, no longer fit the emerging model of professional medicine. In response to this transformation, many barber surgeons sought to legitimize themselves, some by aligning more closely with universities, others by redefining their role altogether. The centuries-long partnership of hair and healing was unraveling. The separation of barbers and surgeons. One of the most symbolic events of this split occurred in England. In 1745, the Company of Barber Surgeons, which had existed since Henry VII's time, was formally divided. The surgeons formed their own body, the Company of Surgeons, which in 1800 became the Royal College of Surgeons of London. No longer associated with barbers, these men now sought recognition as scientific professionals. Surgeons would now require formal medical education, not just guild apprenticeship. Take examinations in anatomy, surgical technique and theory. Publish case studies, essays, and clinical observations. Barbers, meanwhile, returned to their original domain: grooming, shaving, and personal hygiene. The surgical instruments disappeared from their shops, and the focus shifted to the evolving trade of cosmetology and hygiene. In a way, both professions narrowed. The generalist barber surgeon disappeared, replaced by the licensed surgeon and the modern barber. A hybrid profession had split into two distinct careers. The rise of scientific surgery. With this separation came dramatic progress in surgical practice. Freed from the limitations of guild training, surgery developed rapidly in the 19th century. Key developments included anesthesia, 1846. The introduction of ether and later chloroform allowed surgeons to operate without causing unbearable pain, enabling more complex procedures. Antisepsis, 1860s. Joseph Lister's use of carbolic acid revolutionized surgical cleanliness, dramatically reducing infection rates. This transformed surgery from a desperate last resort into a viable, even routine intervention. Professional medical schools. Universities began incorporating surgical training, offering a blend of theory and practice. Surgeons now studied alongside physicians, eventually gaining equal respect. Yet even as surgery advanced, the long legacy of barber surgeons remained in the background, a quiet reminder that medicine had once been a matter of hands as much as minds. Echoes of the past, what was lost? In shedding their connection to barbers, surgeons gained scientific status, but they also lost something: their direct link to the community. Barber surgeons had once been as common as shoemakers and butchers, treating people in towns, villages, and battlefield tents. Their knowledge was practical, rooted in repetition and necessity. They were the people's healers, available without a royal court or university degree. With their disappearance came a widening gap between medical practitioners and the public. Surgery became the domain of hospitals and institutions. The familiar neighborhood figure who could shave your beard and set your broken wrist was gone. The barber pole remained, but its meaning had faded. Cultural memory and symbolism. Today, the image of the barber surgeon persists more as curiosity than memory. yet it lives on in several cultural forms. The barber's pole still rotates outside barbershops, an echo of blood and bandages. The term quack, meaning fraudulent healer, often originated from unlicensed practitioners who tried to fill the space once held by barber surgeons. Historical reenactments often feature barber surgeons treating the wounded in medieval fairs or period dramas, complete with basins, fleams, and soiled aprons. In popular culture, the barber surgeon has become a figure of grim fascination, a combination of blood and bristle, history and horror. Films, novels, and television often depict them as macabre relics from a bloodier past. But this portrayal misses the quiet dignity of the real barber surgeon, a craftsman, a healer, and a witness to the pain of ordinary life. Tools of the trade, preserved legacy. Many museums now house the tools once wielded by barber surgeons. Tooth keys used to twist out decayed molars. Bone saws, long curved blades designed to cut through limbs swiftly. Fleams and lancets stored in ivory cases, often carried on the belt. Cupping glasses and scarificators used in bloodletting rituals. These tools appear brutal to modern eyes, but they were also the best hope many people had in a time when pain was a mystery, infection was a death sentence, and healing came not from pills but from the hands of someone who knew how to cut. Global reflections, other healing craftsmen. While this story has focused on Europe, the figure of the practical, unlicensed healer existed in many other cultures. In Japan, Kaguya blacksmiths often served as ad hoc surgeons in rural areas. In India, the Sushruta Samhita, an ancient medical text, describes itinerant healers who performed nose reconstructions and cataract surgery. In Africa, many traditional barbers also served as minor surgical practitioners, especially in rural areas without clinics. Across cultures, the fusion of grooming and healing was not an accident but a reflection of who had the tools, the trust, and the touch. Closing reflection, when a blade meant trust. In the end, the barber surgeon was not just a historical oddity. He was a symbol of a time when medicine was local, treatment was personal, and skill was earned, not certified. He worked at the messy intersection of care and crisis, body and belief. He held the same blade for hair and for blood, for cleaning a face and saving a life. So we ask, as modern medicine grows more specialized, technological, and distant, what might we learn from the age of the barber surgeon, when healing still belonged to the hands of those who lived among us?